Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the conference. My name is Reddy. I'm the director of the Animal Law Program at Lewis & Clark, and I'm pleased to be able to serve as moderator for this panel entitled Legal Victories, Lessons, and Insights. Before we get started, I'd like to give a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Carroll House Furniture. Thank you also to Stray Dog Institute, Kat Koshkin, and Patrick Cleary for their generous support of the conference. A reminder that the Animal Law Conference has been approved for 10 CLE credits by the MCLE Board of the Supreme Court of Illinois. Attorneys seeking CLE credits will be contacted via email after the conference with instructions on how to secure those credits. Of particular interest for all of us, this session promises to showcase how evolving litigation and policy strategies have engendered recent wins for animals. Our panelists will share what it takes to turn legal action into lasting change for endangered species, animals in entertainment, and the fur industry, and more. A note about this session's format: each of our three panelists will present for approximately 10 minutes, at which point we'll segue into a moderated discussion among the four of us, leaving about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. With that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our session's panelists, whose impressive bios can be found on the conference website. First, we have Elizabeth MeLampy, author of the book Forget the Camel. Next, we have Haley Stewart, Senior Public Policy Manager for Wildlife at Humane World for Animals. And finally, Jessica Blome, attorney at Greenfire Law. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the organizers for putting on such a thoughtful and energizing group of speakers this weekend. I'm here to talk about some of the research that I did for my book, which is called Forget the Camel, The Madcap World of Animal Festivals and What They Say About Being Human, and to discuss some of the legal victories and opportunities that I discovered while doing that research. My book is about animal festivals that take place around the United States. In my definition, animal festivals are basically events that focus on an animal as a key part of the celebration or activity. There's an incredibly broad range of animal festivals that take place in our country. These festivals often bring a lot of good to local communities. They bring valuable dollars into the economies. They offer an opportunity to celebrate traditions and heritage and to build community and identity. But ultimately, most animal festivals, use animals at the animal's expense for our own human celebrations and traditions. So this talk is about legal victories. I want to share a few examples of where legal advocacy has led to real change for animals in the world of animal festivals. I'm going to start by backing up a little. Pigeon shoots used to be a popular sport and event throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In Higgins, Pennsylvania, a giant, very popular pigeon shoot used to take place every Labor Day weekend. This event involved capturing thousands of pigeons, keeping them in small traps, and then releasing them over a killing field where participants would try to shoot them. If they were successful, sometimes the pigeons would be hurt but not killed. Those that could fly away would often go suffer on their own, but if the birds fell to the ground, other people would rush onto the field to finish the job. It was a horrifically violent event, but in the late 1990s, years of protests and activism and strategic litigation combined and worked together to push for what ultimately was the end of the pigeon shoot in Pennsylvania. You had activists who were engaging in civil disobedience and protests both at the event and in the weeks surrounding it. Animal organizations wrote petitions and got as much media attention as they could for this cause, pointing out the gratuitous violence that took place. And then animal lawyers, brought a suit under Pennsylvania's Animal Cruelty Code. And those lawyers eventually succeeded in their case in 1999. And after that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, the organizers stopped the pigeon shoot. So that combination of efforts is what led to the cessation of this highly public, highly violent animal festival. And I offer this event not because it's recent, but as an example of a legal victory that still resonates today and can give us a sort of roadmap of what types of advocacy might combine together in these worlds to create real change. because there's plenty of other killing festivals that still take place around our country today. One such festival is the Rattlesnake Roundup. I wrote a chapter about this in my book. It's really similar to the pigeon shoot, actually. The event involves hunting rattlesnakes from the wild. Hunters use a tactic called gassing, where they pump gasoline into the back of snake dens, which forces the snakes to come out and seek fresh air. And once they capture them, they bring them into this central facility, this arena that's pictured here. And on Roundup weekend, the point of the event, of the whole sort of celebration, is to kill all of the snakes that they've brought in. Here, instead of shooting them over a killing field, they grab a snake and behead it sort of on a stump. And then they skin the snakes. They sell the skins as souvenirs to visitors and attendees. They fry the muscle of the snakes to sell as a snack to attendees. It's kind of the same visceral event. It's very rooted in that same violence as the pigeon shoot. The purpose of this event, according to organizers, is to protect from the threat of increasing rattlesnake populations, but for a lot of scientific reasons, that isn't actually at risk of happening. The other reason that they offer for this event is education. They want to educate the public on how to safely interact with rattlesnakes, which in this logic means killing them. I'm offering this festival not necessarily as an example where success has already happened, but where advocacy is actively ongoing. This event in Sweetwater, Texas, that I attended, the one that's pictured here, happens every year still to this day. But advocates and protesters and lawyers are hard at work on this. They're engaging in the same types of media campaigns that contributed to success with the pigeon shoots. There's also a blueprint of what might come next for rattlesnake roundups in particular. In Georgia, rattlesnake roundups also used to be very common. But thanks to a lot of pressure from animal advocates and lawyers, people leveraging environmental laws and the Endangered Species Act, Georgia's events have all transitioned to no-kill events. So they still bring rattlesnakes in for educational purposes. They do demonstrations with a handful of snakes who have been rescued, but they don't do the killing pieces anymore. They celebrate with the carnival and the fair and the food trucks and all the trappings that make a festival fun without the actual killing. So there's a blueprint for this. We'll see what happens in Sweetwater. My hope is this is a legal victory in progress, but we'll see. And lastly, I want to mention a giant win that happened in the animal festival world this year. Mexico City banned bullfighting after years of advocacy, court cases, and legislative efforts. You see some of the similar ingredients that you see in these other contexts, petitions, media campaigns, lawsuits. Ultimately, the city's legislature here outlawed violent bullfighting. That likely would not have been possible without those combinations of other strategies that helped build that strong political momentum towards change. So the debates around bullfighting remind us of the complexity involved in all animal festivals, all around the country and all around the world. Namely, how do we square the human cultural importance that we get from those festivals with the harm that we're causing to the animals in that process? I also want to just briefly mention that animal festivals are not all about killing animals. Those, I think, are the ones where we see the most obvious and easiest strides towards progress, in part because the harm is so obvious. But many animal festivals around the country use animals in ways that aren't lethal at all. And in fact, many events actually even focus on welfare. So I like to think about animal festivals in these three categories, which kind of mirror our broader relationships with animals: dominance, humor, and reverence. Everything I've mentioned so far would fall into my dominance category. But I want to just quickly mention a few others that display humor or reverence to give you a fuller picture of what animal festivals look like in our country and what those same tools of advocacy and progress might lead towards in that context. This is a photo from the International Camel and Ostrich races in Virginia City, Nevada. Human jockeys ride ostriches and camels around a track, trying to stay on as long as they can while the animal is trying to buck them off. So in this photo, you can see an ostrich in the background who has skidded onto her chest. Her rider flew over her front. And in the foreground, you can see a jockey falling backwards off of her ostrich. This event isn't about killing animals. No one dies. But it's meant to be really funny. It's about creating this uproarious slapstick environment. And the animals are just props in that effort. But the animals are regulated by the Animal Welfare Act, and they receive some protections that are increasing kind of as time goes on. Here's a photo from a frog jumping contest that takes place in California every year. The point of this contest is to get the frog to jump as far as you can. You have 3 jumps to get the maximum distance. So to do this, jockeys set a frog on a starting lily pad and then scare it as scary as they can be. They stomp, they clap, they lunge at the frog to try to get it to jump as far as it can. Despite that kind of like scaring as the main technique here, this event really focuses on frog welfare. There's a chief welfare officer. The frogs spend their time between competitions resting in the frog spa. I'm not making this up. And I think this is a really interesting event to track because 30 years ago, 25 years ago, there was no welfare code for these frogs. Frogs died all the time. It sort of was just, it was almost unthinking. It wasn't the purpose to kill them, but it was an accepted part of the process. And so we see some progress with these welfare measures being put in. Lastly, I'd be remiss to talk about animal festivals without mentioning Punxsutawney Phil and his annual prediction on Groundhog Day in Pennsylvania. Phil is certainly beloved and worshipped, but he spends his whole life in this little enclosure carried around for tourists to take selfies with. So I want to close my initial presentation by reminding you all that animal festivals don't happen in a void. They reenact and celebrate local history, local tradition, and they bring a lot of good to the humans involved. Even the killing festivals have a beneficial purpose. It might be harder for us to see sitting in this room, but that purpose exists. So this panel is about legal victories, and I think in the festival world, we can see a clear trend where victories have actually occurred. It's in those killing contests where the debate between human benefit and animal cost has a clear answer. Animal deaths, especially torturous ones, are often too high of a price for people to accept for human fun. But I give those other examples as a way to push the logic of that calculation. As you're all sitting here, what do you think about those examples? I think animal festivals offer opportunities to create some very visible, powerful change. We can use our full toolkit as lawyers to, from advocacy to media to litigation to legislation and more, because you never know exactly what the right piece is that's going to fall into place to create that lasting change. By the numbers, animal festivals do not affect as many animals as factory farming or research, for example. But there is something symbolically powerful about what they offer to people thinking about animals in their own communities, how they learn to interact with animals. Is hurting an animal worth it for us to have fun? If not, how do we move forward? So progress and victory might look like shutting down an event, ending the pigeon shoots, or it might look like reshaping to maintain the good and lose the harm, like a transition to a no-kill roundup. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists on their insights on legal victories, but that's all I have for now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Haley Stewart, and I am a Senior Public Policy Manager for Humane World for Animals, formerly known as Humane Society of the United States and Humane Society International. And I work in our Wildlife Protection Department, and I currently oversee our U.S. policy on the fur trade. And just a little bit of background about me, I didn't really start my career to get into working on fur issues. My background is actually more in wildlife conservation policy and habitat conservation. But I found myself really passionate about the fur issue, specifically because it's this incredible intersection of so many different issues that I'm passionate about. It is wildlife, it is animal welfare, it's public health, it's environmental. And so if you are finding yourselves curious about all of these different issues and want to explore how these issues all intersect, definitely come talk to me, and I'm happy to talk to you more about the fur trade. Today I'm going to share with you updates on US and global efforts to end fur farming and the sale of fur products. And I'm going to be covering recent successes and challenges that we've been working to overcome. Now, I'll specify that I'm primarily going to be talking about fur factory farming, not so much about trapping, despite that also being a really significant portion of the fur trade. But for those of you who are less familiar with this industry, so currently tens of millions of undomesticated animals like foxes and mink are held captive and killed in fur factory farms every year solely for fashion. And most fur farms, they're located overseas, primarily in China and a handful of EU countries as well. But they do still exist here in North America, in the US and Canada. And this industry is notoriously known for animal cruelty surrounding the care and slaughter of fur-farmed animals. These animals are typically killed by gassing, and foxes are even still killed by electrocution. And that's largely because this industry lacks significant regulations around the care and slaughter of fur-farmed animals. They fall into this gray area that agencies don't really want to have the responsibility of overseeing. They're not really wildlife, they're not really farm animals. What are they? Nobody wants to take that responsibility, and so there's very few regulations around these animals. Few states even require these operations to have a permit to operate. There are also immense public health risks with these facilities. They spread diseases like COVID and avian influenza, and there's significant environmental harm. The climate impact of animal fur products is significantly more than other products used for fashion, including plastic-based fashion products. So if you ever hear the fallacy that animal fur is at least it's better than faux fur because faux fur is made of plastic, that is just misinformation from the fur industry. Don't believe it. Be smart. These are horrible industries. It's not just the cruelty, but they are immensely harmful for the environment. But I'm here today to tell you about some good news. If you may have recently seen a really fantastic article by Kenny Torella with Vox, you may have seen this graph. This is data that we have collected over a number of years, and it shows that this industry is in rapid decline, and that's largely due to corporate outreach and policy change. So you'll see that in 2014, over 140 million mink, foxes, chinchillas, and raccoon dogs were killed in fur factory farms for their fur. And as of last year, that number has dropped to around 20 million. Yeah. Now, while there's no real reliable tracking of fur farms in the US, we believe there are fewer than 100 mink farms remaining in the country. However, we have no idea how many fox farms still operate in the United States. Now, this success is largely due to brands and retailers adopting fur-free policies. You may have recently seen the announcement from Condé Nast, which is the parent company of Vogue, and they have adopted a formal fur-free policy, and that's huge for the fashion industry. But proactive legislation and regulation is also leading to a major decline in this industry. Most of that progress is coming from Europe. They're leading the world in making major policy shifts for fur-farmed animals. Currently, 23 countries have prohibited fur farming in the EU and UK. And just this week, Poland's parliament approved a ban on fur farming, setting an 8-year phase-out period. And that's pending some additional legislative steps, but we expect Poland to be number 24 very soon. There was also a European Citizens Initiative recently passed. So it's sort of like a ballot initiative where they collect signatures from citizens all over Europe, and they put it forward to the European Commission, asking them to take action on an issue. And this European Citizens Initiative asked them to do something about fur farming and fur sales, to ban these things. And we are expecting a decision by the European Commission, hopefully sometime next year. British Columbia also prohibits mink fur farming, and Israel prohibits the sale of new fur products. And groups are working in Switzerland and the UK right now to ban the sale of fur imports. Unfortunately, but not all that surprisingly, the US is woefully behind the rest of the world, at least behind Europe. Fur farming, like I said, it's practically unregulated here, and for that reason, it's really critical that we continue to push policy change. While there are very few fur farms in the United States, it's the third largest importer of new fur products in the world, only behind Russia and South Korea. So we are working to tackle this issue by prohibiting the sale of new fur products, and that includes clothing, accessories, and home decor. Now, this effort started over a decade ago in California. It was actually West Hollywood that passed the first ordinance to prohibit the sale of new fur products, and 3 additional cities in California followed suit. There were federal legal challenges to 2 of California's ordinances. One claimed that it violated the US Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, and the other claimed that, you might not be surprised by this, that it violated the Dormant Commerce Clause. Both of those cases were dismissed, and that builds on a significant and still growing body of case law affirming the right of cities and states to prohibit the sale of fur and other cruel animal products. California then passed a statewide ban in 2019, and that was really significant because they were the #1 fur-selling state in the country at the time. They sold about 25% of all new fur products in the country. And that law also included in-person sales and online sales, and that's super significant because you think about how fashion is being sold today, and most of it's online. So we need to tackle not only in-store sales, but also the online sales component. Now other cities are following suit. There are ordinances all over the country, and we are continuing to try to build onto that. And we are working on state legislation as well to try to get fur sales and fur farming bans across the country. And while we are looking at options to prohibit fur farming altogether, there are some states that are looking to regulate this industry if banning them outright is not currently viable. We are seeing this effort in Minnesota. The Department of Natural Resources there is currently working on regulations regarding fur farms, which would require inspections and disease mitigation. And while it's not a full ban, that would at least provide us some tracking of where these industries are, where these facilities are, and the animals involved and how many animals are involved. And we're hoping to see similar legislation in Ohio very soon. And this is in response to a really severe animal cruelty case that our animal rescue team responded to earlier this year. And I was actually on site for this rescue. Hundreds of animals were kept in fur and urine farms, as well as being bred for pets. This coyote that you see, he was one of those animals on that farm, and we were able to get him out and put him into a sanctuary, and he's doing wonderfully now. Now I want to talk for a minute about challenges and opportunities that we're facing. You know, this is a very new campaign when it comes to policy. Tackling the fur issue has been around for decades, but addressing it from a policy perspective is very new, and we are still learning. And that means that our legislation needs to evolve over time as we learn and grow from this effort, and as we look at what's possible with today's political landscape. So that means we have to be willing to make compromises and find middle ground and to try to get this legislation passed. And a really good example of this has been our effort to focus on farmed fur products in our legislation. In previous years, our bills focused on farmed fur as well as hunted and trapped fur. But we found it necessary to focus our legislation on farmed fur in an effort to find common ground and reduce opposition from hunting and fishing groups, indigenous communities, and religious communities. And you may be wondering, why fishing groups? Why would fishing groups be opposed to fur? Well, I'm not an angler myself, but I found out in working on this legislation that a lot of fly fishers use animal hair to make fly ties. And so, you know, one email from the Sport Fishing Association in Washington was all that was needed to kill our bill there. And so we learned very quickly that we need to find some compromises if we want to start moving this legislation in certain states, if their industries are powerful enough to kill our bills. Now, that doesn't mean we aren't working on trapping. We don't care about that issue. We do. But we need to think strategically about what's currently possible with the legislative vehicle that we're working with. And it also allows us to work with non-traditional allies on fur factory farming. You know, indigenous communities may have been opposed to our bills originally, but if we can remove trapping from that, we might actually see them as partners on this, or at least get them to neutral. And of course, we have to navigate a growing number of preemption laws. That's really disheartening. They don't just deal with companion animal issues, but they affect a wide range of animal issues. And I'll just leave you with this, the title of my presentation is Closing the Chapter on Fur Farming and Sales, and we have not closed the chapter on this. We have made significant progress, but this is still a very serious issue with over 20 million animals minimum killed for their fur every year solely for fashion. And we need to keep working and fighting this industry until it ends. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Animal Legal Defense Fund for inviting me here. As Professor Reddy indicated, my name is Jessica Blome. I'm an attorney at the public interest environmental and animal law firm Greenfire Law, which is located in Berkeley, California. I'm here to talk about a recent victory in one of my cases involving the Endangered Species Act. As many of you know, since its inception more than 50 years ago, the Endangered Species Act has been considered the most comprehensive legislation for the preservation of endangered and threatened species ever enacted by any nation. Famously, the United States Supreme Court once said in TVA v. Hill that the ESA embodies Congress's commitment to halt and reverse the trend toward species extinction, whatever the cost. The case I'm going to discuss today is styled Bear Warriors United versus Alexis Lambert, who is the Secretary of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. The case reflects the power of the Endangered Species Act, of course, but it begins with a story about animals. It begins with a story about the Florida manatee. Maybe. There we go. The Florida manatee is a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, which is found in the coastal waters of Florida. It is listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. They are herbivores that feed opportunistically on a wide variety of submerged, floating, and emergent vegetation. But seagrass is the Florida manatee's preferred forage due to its nutritional density and wide availability. The average adult manatee weighs 2,200 pounds and consumes between 4 and 15% of its weight in aquatic plants daily. The North Indian River Lagoon is located on the eastern coast of Florida on the Atlantic Ocean. It includes there's portions of the Indian River Lagoon, and then there's the North Indian River Lagoon. The North Indian River Lagoon is designated as critical habitat for Florida manatees under the Endangered Species Act, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Manatee Recovery Plan considers the North Indian River Lagoon the most important spring habitat on the east coast of Florida. This is largely because historically extensive sea bass spreads covered the entirety of the Indian River Lagoon, including the North IRL. But through baseline surveys conducted in 1943, the Water Management District down there believes that the seagrass coverage was at least 70,000 acres. But the North Indian River Lagoon also benefits from some human artificial production of hot water that comes from a power plant located at Cape Canaveral. And that hot water warms the water around the North Indian River Lagoon and provides manatees an overwintering refuge. Due to the North Indian River Lagoon's rich supply of this seagrass and this hot water, every manatee on the Atlantic coast evolved to spend at least some part of her year or his year in the North Indian River Lagoon. But the Indian River Lagoon is dead or dying. Since 1996, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration has characterized the North IRL as hyper-eutrophic, with degraded water quality and harmful algal blooms that no longer support significant seagrass coverage. According to our experts, eutrophication is the overabundance of nutrients in a water body that result in harmful algal blooms, fish kills, and in some cases, ecosystem collapse. And I put a little graphic, which maybe many of you have seen, or maybe not, because maybe we're not a bunch of environmental lawyers. But on I believe it'll be your right-hand side, eutrophication looks like nutrient loading coming into the water body through various sources that causes an oversupply of nutrients to plants that live in the water system. The plants that most easily and readily consume the nutrients are algae, which then blanket the subsurface of the water, causing a light deficiency for the lower plants, which ultimately kills the lagoon. All right. Okay. The North Indian River Lagoon has lost 50 to 90% of historical seagrass coverage since 2009. As seagrass disappeared from the lagoon, the manatee's diet shifted from those rich, dense, nutritionally effective seagrasses to the algae blooms that are in the lagoon. But they've also been seen hoisting themselves up onto the side of the water body, trying to eat terrestrial plants in order to eat something, which is an absolutely devastating thing to see. The algae in the lagoon can become toxic. You've heard about a lot of red tides in Florida and other types of harmful algal toxic blooms that then can infect the manatees when they eat the toxic algae and kill them in this way as well. So, 2 unusual mortality events have occurred in the North Indian River Lagoon since 2013. One was in 2013 and the most recent one was from 2021 to 2023. Both were caused by lack of seagrass in the lagoon. The first one involved the harmful toxic algae that we were just discussing. The other was just straight starvation. Florida state officials struggled to respond to this. And I hate having to put pictures of dead animals, but I think it's important to see that the sheer scope of the thousands of deaths that they were dealing with. On the left, you can see that the state marine manatee veterinarian, of which there's one, she does over a team of veterinary technicians, but she's just the only one. Her name is Dr. Martine DeWitt, conducting a necropsy on a smattering of manatees that died in 2021. On the right-hand side is the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission attempt to feed manatees with supplemental romaine lettuce. They also fed them hyacinths during this time to try and help them, but it largely was regarded as a failure. So to reverse the eutrophication in the North IRL, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection developed what's called a Basin Management Action Plan, and they're very proud of this. The Basin Management Action Plan is a voluntary program of mostly just a funding pot for voluntary applications for projects that people submit, whether industry groups or wastewater treatment facilities in municipalities or counties. There's one that was submitted by an angler or like a fishing organization trying to propose projects that would clean up the Indian River Lagoon. But the state of Florida itself has not proposed any projects, nor is it undertaking any projects, nor is any of these projects enforceable. You could go after them for classic fraud if they didn't implement the project, but many of them aren't being implemented. So there's just millions of dollars flowing out into, industry for whatever reason that's not being used. And confirming this on April 25, 2024, despite this lofty plan that they hold up as the answer, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection publicly announced that nitrogen and phosphorus loading reduction levels established in the 2021 BMAP designed to reduce nutrients in the lagoon and restore seagrass coverage had flatlined. So you can see the flatline there in the graph. So there was minimal progress and then no progress, and maybe a little bit in one estimate for the project reductions, but mostly they have no hope. So until seagrass returns, at the same time, that watershed district announced that seagrasses were now 1% to 3% of historical averages, such that they are ecologically irrelevant in the North IRL. So enter the Endangered Species Act. I put this from the preamble on the slide because, and I don't want to read it in its entirety, but I think it's important to understand that in the actual statutory provisions of the Endangered Species Act, Congress highlighted the importance of habitat. The Endangered Species Act must provide a means whereby ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend may be conserved, to provide a program for the conservation of those species, and to take appropriate steps to achieve the treaties, including CITES, which we heard about yesterday. So in the Endangered Species Act, it's a citizen suit provision that anyone can use to enforce this Endangered Species Act. The primary way to enforce the Endangered Species Act is through Section 9, which prohibits the take of any threatened or endangered species. The term take means to harass or harm, and then a number of other terms that mean interfere with the species in any way, really. There's a regulatory definition of harm adopted by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. There's also a regulatory definition of harass. I'll put them both up. But it's important that harm includes that significant habitat modification or degradation that was contemplated by the statutory text. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, since adopting these rules, has implemented the Endangered Species Act in that way. That's significant because that's what happened to the North Indian River Lagoon. But the definition of harass is important as well because it includes disruption to normal behavior patterns, including but not limited to breeding, feeding, and sheltering. So, that's a little too fast. So what we proved in trial, so first we had a summary judgment motion, then we had trial. We proved with our expert witnesses that the North IRL is not going to recover anytime soon. The state admitted that the collapse of the lagoon's seagrass beds caused and will continue to cause malnourishment in manatees, that malnourishment disrupts manatees' natural behaviors, leading to emaciation and even starvation and death, that malnourishment alone also significantly alters a manatee's feeding and breeding behaviors because it disrupts their efforts to meet daily energy needs, and that interferes with both feeding and reproduction and weaning of baby manatees. And finally, that manatees in the North IRL cannot locate and consume the level of naturally appropriate vegetation because of seagrass loss. The malnourishment affecting weaning is extremely important because, as you saw, the UME has closed. The unusual mortality event caused by that mass starvation event in 2021, 2022, 2023 has ended. But now we're seeing an uptick in baby deaths, baby manatees and juvenile manatees. So the judge was able to say this threat is ongoing. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection didn't really defend against this on the facts. Most of our evidence derived from their own manatee veterinarian and their own reports and language in their own Basin Management Action Plan and elsewhere, proving that the Florida Department of Environmental Protection sewage regulatory regime caused this collapse. What we had to prove was that the collapse had impacted the manatees, and that took veterinarians and other types of evidence. And so they attacked our standing, classic. They argued crazily that the Clean Water Act, like their compliance with the Clean Water Act, because they had a sewage regulatory program that was approved by APA, exempted them from Endangered Species Act protections. The judge quickly dismissed that idea. They argued that the 10th Amendment anti-commandeering doctrine prevented the implementation of an injunction against the Florida Department of Environmental Protection because, in fact, any injunction would require the state to enforce the ESA, which was a federal, not a state law, ignoring the part of the Endangered Species Act that says any person who violates the Endangered Species Act can be liable. So the judge also quickly dispensed with that, and he was very annoyed with them. They kept bringing that one up. They argued that the scope of the injunction was too broad. They continue that. They really continue that in their appeal on the 11th Circuit. And then they alleged that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was about to rescind, but hasn't yet, the definition of harm, which is what includes that habitat modification and degradation language. And so our case would soon be moot, but not yet, but soon be. So please dismiss the case. Obviously, that's speculative, so the judge dismissed that as well. So this was an important case, and I wanted to end with highlighting that on appeal at the 11th Circuit, where we are now, case is fully briefed. The government filed their reply on Friday. We have a ton of amici, so if you're with any of these organizations that filed the amici brief, thank you, an amicus brief, for your participation. Lovely group of environmental and animal law professors, and then you can see that they managed to get the Pacific Legal Foundation to get involved because they always want to be, and a bunch of industry groups wanting to protect septic tanks because the nutrient loading from the lagoon is largely attributed to unbridled home development with septic tanks instead of centralized sewer. So with that, I will sit down so we can answer some questions.
So thank you all for those really incredibly compelling presentations. I have so many questions for you all during this panel discussion portion of our session. And for those of us who are in the audience, just a reminder, we've set aside 10 minutes for Q&A, so please continue giving thought to what questions you might have for our panelists. I thought I'd start by posing a question to all three of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Jessica. So when you're selecting your next projects or next project, whether it's as a litigator, an artist, a storyteller, a campaign manager, or otherwise, how do you consider the potential risks or blowback or adverse consequences of those projects? And if so, could you offer some examples?
Well, I think we'll endlessly consider them. The risk of blowback is always a concern. And I often get calls from very nervous, worried people about what I'm doing or what I'm thinking of doing or what I'm proposing to do, that the consequence might be X, Y, and Z, and have you considered that? And I really do like those calls, so if you have thoughts like that, please call me. Because it gets me to think about things that maybe I wouldn't have, or maybe I already did, or maybe I didn't understand the scope of the concern. So I think about it, and sometimes we will maybe decide not to do it if the risk is too great or the likelihood of success is too low. But most of the time, we account for those risks in the plan and move forward. I will say, though, with this recent case with the Endangered Species Act in Florida, I think that I always worried about losing and what that would mean. I never thought what it meant if I won. And everybody really cares about this. The United States Congress is thinking about it. We're hearing rumors that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hasn't posted or finalized that harm rule because they might make some changes to better address this victory so it never happens again. So I don't think when we filed it or briefed it, we saw the Trump administration as our ally, as our defendant so much as it ended up being. So there's some unknowns to it that you can't really consider, and you kind of just have to plow forward.
Yeah, I would say pretty similar to that, and what resonated with me is the feedback that you get from other people. We don't do this work on our own. We are surrounded by other people, compassionate people who care about this issue, and you really do need to rely on your team and be humble about what you don't know. So, a good example of that for me was like with the fly fishing ties, and I didn't know. And once I learned, that allowed me to grow and think about new ways to shape our legislation. But I think for me, one really key example of blowback that we really had to consider in our legislation was removing that trapped fur component, which, as an animal advocate was really hard for me to accept. I deal with wildlife issues, and I've seen some really horrific videos of animals being trapped and killed, and acknowledging that, my fur sales bills are not the right legislative vehicle to tackle that issue was a hard pill to swallow. And there were always questions coming up from my team and our executives. Well, if we remove trapping, is that going to increase the number of trapped animals? Because if we tackle fur farming, then we're creating this void of fur, so we're going to increase trapping, so those pelts can fill that market. And we really had to consider that. And at the end of the day, I don't see that happening because trapping is also just plummeting as an industry. But we also have to acknowledge that, like I said, we do care about trapping, and we are working on trapping. We're going to continue working on trapping. It's just this fur sales bill wasn't the right vehicle for that, and we need to look at other strategies to address trapping in ways that are meaningful and include a number of different stakeholders.
I agree with everything that you both said. I think the external blowback and the internal blowback are both really important to think about. I think that I'll add two things. One is sometimes external blowback is not the worst. It might mean you're on the right track. Like if you're getting a lot of negativity or people are particularly angry about something that you're saying, I think sometimes that's a sign that you've found the right nerve to hit for various reasons. And then the second thing I'll add is that I think about a lot of animal law things, and obviously part of my choice to write a book was in this same vein of thinking about what story do I want to tell about animals? How do I want to help people think about animals differently? And I think when you're thinking about and I know stories underlie litigation and legislative efforts, of course, also, but those stories, I think we heard a lot yesterday. Many panelists mentioned variations of, coming up with something palatable. Not everyone wants to hear the hard truths about animals right off the bat, especially if they're sort of uninitiated into the world that we all occupy every day. And so I think it's about, not turning people off before you even get to the, where you want to bring them. How do you bring them along on that journey rather than kind of hitting them with the deep stuff first? And I think, in that context, thinking about blowback might not be the right word, but thinking about kind of, that negative response is actually really important to help get your message across as advocates.
Yeah, thank you all for those really nuanced answers, and particularly sort of speaking to the tailored approach you sometimes have to take, and inviting diverse stakeholders to offer input in order to sort of inform the best strategy to pursue. This question is for you, Elizabeth. Were there sort of common strategies or themes across the different sort of advocacy victories that you studied that you found to be particularly successful?
Yeah, I think that it's always like a matrix of which animal and which harm that sort of leads to this answer of how successful you'll be. So some animals are really sympathetic. People really, we all know this, like love some animals more than others, and you'll just get better response from people if you're talking about dogs than if you're talking about snakes. And so I think that's sort of like, you have one, I'm not good at math, but like one kind of axis going with what species. And then what's the harm? Like, I think the worst harms are maybe killing, torturing, those types of things. Those tend to elicit the biggest and sort of strongest emotional response from people. Or even your opponents, like even people who want to keep doing this, they might have some sort of sympathy for where you're coming from. And I think that can be really powerful. And as you kind of move down that axis towards things like exhibition or things like, kind of showing off an animal, those don't harm the animal quite as much as killing or torturing, but it's not perfect for the animal, I would say. And so you kind of have these two pieces going. And as I think when you look at places where advocacy has really led to success, you often have both of those pieces going for you. So you have a sympathetic animal, or you have an animal you can tell a really powerful story about, and you have some harm that is kind of outsized, like a inappropriately large amount of harm to befall that animal for the purpose that you're offering. And so I think that's kind of aligns a lot of the research that I did.
Yeah, it's really compelling to think about these different axes and how those intersections can inform the type of dialogues that you're able to have and efforts you're able to advance. This question is for Haley. So since California passed its first sales ban, we've yet to see another state sort of follow suit. Why do you think that is, and how are you trying to overcome that?
Yeah, that's been really difficult. If anyone is familiar with California legislation, you'll know that it's a pretty good state to work on, work in when it comes to animal welfare and environmental issues. And a lot of other states, they're just not as easy to get legislators on board. And sometimes in a number of states, if you tell them, well, California passed it, that's automatically a turnoff, actually. So it was great that California tackled that issue because they were the #1 fur-selling state in the country, but now we are really struggling to get bills passed in other states, and I think that's largely because the fur industry found out very quickly that they can't win on this issue by themselves. They are not strong enough to fight this issue, to fight our bills by themselves, and so they have brought in a number of coalition partners to help them, and that includes hunting and trapping organizations, that includes the Farm Bureau, and it includes people from all over the country that are showing up to oppose a bill in a certain state. And so we are really struggling to get these bills passed, and that's why we are trying to find compromise where we can get it. And that means, giving ground where you can. And if we can get the hunting and trapping groups to neutral, then, I do think that we can have some success. Just this year, we're trying this strategy, and I personally had conversations with these opposition groups. I met face-to-face with representatives from, backcountry hunters and anglers and other industry groups, and I talked to them about their concerns and took them seriously. There was something that a speaker said yesterday about giving justice to those impacted voices and hearing them and acknowledging their concerns. and saying, okay, well, you are not our target. Fly ties, that's not really our main concern. My main concern is, long fur coats and fur trim and fur palm hats. So what can we do? How can we work together to address your concerns and get you to neutral? Backcountry hunters and anglers, they'll probably never support our bills. That's okay, but if we can remove their opposition, that allows us to progress. And we have seen our bills start to move out of committees finally because we were willing to make that compromise.
Yeah, it's really engaging to think about just these alliances that form and how you, again, have to sort of meet with the different individuals or organizations within that coalition to advance the particular measure that you're looking to affect. This is a question for Jessica. I'm wondering if we can return to your initial remarks regarding how you assess sort of the risks involved when determining what new projects that you might undertake. And with respect to the manatee case in particular, I'm wondering if you can speak to how the erosion of stare decisis or this judicial norm that decisions from prior cases create binding precedent, how that factors into your calculation of the risk.
That's a great question, and I'll say that's a great question because I get to talk about something I wanted to talk about. So first I'll say that the loggerhead turtle case, which is one of the more famous Endangered Species Act cases, not only because it has the name of the species in the caption title, but because it was the first time anybody used the Endangered Species Act to sue a government for its regulatory control over a topic, and that is 11th Circuit precedent, and it's still good. So going into this case, we knew that we at least had loggerhead turtle. We might be risking overturning it because who knows who we're going to get at the 11th Circuit this time. But the moment we have it, so we should not avoid using it, right? Like that's kind of my mantra a lot of times with precedent and stare decisis. It's there, let us use it, let us expand upon it until it's broken. And sometimes you don't know if you're going to be the one that breaks it, and it'll be someone else or some issue that you didn't think about. But I also, with specificity about this case, the environmentalists, and I know we're all environmentalists in this room, like there's no real divergent between environmentalists and animal lawyers, but there's sometimes a little peak of a difference. And this case kind of was an exemplary of that because they're really worried about it. Like they think about classic endangered species litigation about animals in the wild, thinks about species as a whole. So I was always getting this question, is there a population level impact? Has the population rebounded? And I was like, I don't care. Why does that matter? Let us not assume that matters. Because we have pictures of dead manatees in trenches. We have pictures of manatees with peanut heads because they're starving. We have pictures of dead baby manatees because they can't find seagrass when they're ready to wean from their emaciated mothers. That's what matters under the Endangered Species Act. So I brought my frame of thinking from other litigation I had done under the Endangered Species Act to protect wild animals in captivity from dangerous habitats, which are just single individual animals representative of that species in that zoo, to wild animals in their natural environment. Why is there suffering? Why does that suffering need to be collective or have a population level impact for the Endangered Species Act to protect them? I rejected it. It was inconceivable to me that could be real. And it wasn't. And that our judge was like, it doesn't have to be a population level impact. It can be, starving, emaciated, sick manatees now, and in any number, until the seagrass has been restored in the lagoon, are suffering from Endangered Species Act take, and so I'm going to enjoin it. And so I think as animal lawyers, sometimes using these wonderful environmental precedents can be an enormous opportunity for us to inject that thinking into the court system, into the litigation, into the opinions, into the arguments.
Thank you so much. And this question is for Haley. The fur issue has been around for decades, and it seems like such a small industry, and maybe sort of exemplified by your slide. But what would you say to decision makers who think that because of that this is just no longer an issue?
Yeah, and I struggle with that, and I often get comments of, "Oh, you work on fur? I thought we were done with that."
Oh no,
are we done with that? People still wear fur. Yeah, people still wear fur, including here in the United States, a lot of fur. And like I said, we're still looking at minimum over 200 million animals that are killed in fur factory farms. That's a minimum. We have no idea truly how many animals there are in fur factory farms here in the United States. That doesn't include rabbits. That doesn't include a large number of animals that are unaccounted for. And so this still is a very big issue. Even if it's not present in the room right now, it is still very, very big issue. And I'll also say it's sort of that like, well, it's not happening here, so why should we care? So I mentioned that China has the largest number of fur farms in the world. Hands down, China has the largest number of fur factory farms. And so it's sort of this mentality of like, well, they're not here, and we can't really do anything about what's happening in China. And so, I mean, that's why we're working on fur sales. We have to remove ourselves from supporting that industry. Even if we ended fur factory farming in the United States or had amazing regulations that we somehow could deal with, we're still importing large numbers of fur products from these really cruel facilities that have no regulations in other countries. And the only way to really tackle this issue from a global perspective is to just say no. We need to stop importing these products. We need to stop selling them. And we need to remove our communities from supporting this industry as a whole.
Yeah, I'll add too, I mean, some of the animals you mentioned, raccoon dogs and mink, some of those are the animals in which we're seeing significant spread of disease in light of the pandemic and the need to sort of combat really these cauldrons of contagion that we're creating, another sort of foothold, I think, as well. To Elizabeth, so how do some of the legal victories that you mentioned, sometimes in small towns or rural communities, how do those contribute to the larger trajectory of animal protection that you think we're seeing?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I mean, animal festivals are by no means like the biggest by the numbers harm that we conduct on animals, as we all know. And similar, I think, to your people's response to your fur farm work, people would ask me like, why animal festivals? Like, why not write a book about factory farming or whatever? And I think like there's a couple pieces of it. One is, I think animal festivals are actually a really kind of useful, fruitful way to delve into animal topics for people who don't know anything about animals. In part because there's no sort of like, I call it like brain junk about animals, like kind of floating around in the back of their head about this. Whereas if you start talking about eating animals, a lot of people will instantly turn off. They like are not interested or willing or able to have that conversation right away. But if you're talking about a frog jumping contest, people are like, frogs. Like there's sort of an openness, a willingness to engage in the questions because in some ways it's more hypothetical. It doesn't affect most of our daily lives. Even people in these communities, it affects them kind of once a year, right? It's not something that is deep in their family culture, in their traditions, in their own kind of daily choices. And so for that, I find animal festivals to be kind of fruitful in how they disarm people and sort of let you come to these questions with as open of a mind as I think you can. And the second reason I think these kind of small victories in one-off communities have an impact is what they teach attendees, and specifically children. So at the Rattlesnake Roundup in Sweetwater, I watched a family. There's like these viewing windows down low near the ground, so you can look at the snakes as they are slithering around. And I saw a family, there were two kids kind of, bent down looking at the snakes through this window, and who I presume to be one of their parents bent down next to them and said, look how scary those snakes are. And was teaching those kids that fear was the appropriate response to snakes. And that, I think, I don't know what was in those children's head before the adult said something, but I saw what I saw. And so I think there's this, and that same pattern was repeated at every festival I went to. Variations of teaching kids how to engage with animals, teaching kids what to think about animals. And a lot of that is not aggression or violence or sort of, maybe the most obvious worst of the worst responses, but it is shades of indifference. It's thinking through how do we react to certain species? Do we care that this animal is experiencing some harm? Those types of things, I think you watch them being kind of taught and reinscribed every single year. So if we magically stopped all of that, I don't think it's gonna, tomorrow make us all a fully vegan country, but I think it's a step on the right path towards reshaping how we think about animals in a way that is less nuanced for people in some ways.
Now, I was struck by, I think the final image from your presentation with those little kids with the butterfly wings. And it reminded me of New York's sort of campaign against the spotted lanternfly. And I didn't know if it was quite sort of a festival per se, but encouraging young people and their parents to sort of see it and squish it, and what sort of questions are we not asking, and by creating sort of these competitions and sort of creating community and culture around it. So really, really interesting. I have just one more question, so folks who have questions, if you want to go ahead and start lining up at the mics, we'll start taking those here in a moment, but we'll end this section with a question for Haley. Do you think some of the successes that we're seeing in Europe on the fur trade will trickle into other countries, maybe the US?
I really hope so. Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing. I mentioned Poland. So Poland there are a handful of countries in Europe that still have fur factory farming, and Poland, I think it's like second or third. It's, I think, Finland and Denmark and then Poland. And so if Poland bans fur factory farming in their country, I mean, that's huge. And there are some federal bills to ban fur farming in the United States. I don't have a lot of hope for federal legislation right now. But I think that our state legislators are looking at what's happening internationally, and I think they take that to heart. If we can get the European Commission to ban fur farming throughout the European Union next year, I think states would really take that to heart, and we could make some progress here. My concern is sort of the converse of that. If we ban fur farming in Europe, are we going to see an increase in fur farming in the United States? Because there is no regulation. It's basically a free-for-all here. A lot of the farmers it's a small industry, they all know each other. So a lot of the farmers, say in Poland, they have a cousin with a fur farm in Wisconsin. So why not just, close up shop in Poland and move their industries over here? And so that's a real concern, and that's why I say we really need to continue tackling this issue. If we don't, we could see potential increases here in this country.
Thank you. And we have about 10 or so minutes for questions. Maybe we'll start over here.
Hi, I'm Trent, and my question actually is for Haley, but I guess if anyone else has ideas on it, chime in also. I get the sense when you mention, obviously, the recent Condé Nast announcement, and then I think during the question and answer period, you said, you kind of did the, who wears fur nowadays? That kind of, I get the sense that a big driver, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, for the decline in fur use, at least in the US, is it's uncool. What do you think are the factors leading to that vibe? As I said, I don't know if that's the case, but it does seem that way to me, where at the Oscars, you're not going to see people draped in furs all over the place anymore, like we did in the 50s and 60s maybe. So yeah, what do you think has led to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, and please feel free to chime in if you guys have other ideas about this, but I really do think that so much has been leadership by brands and retailers, seeing the ends of this industry and how these animals suffer, and taking that back and saying we won't accept that. And so much of that has been led by organizations and activists. Making this issue visible and not letting it go away, making it ever present. I think a lot of it was, in the mid-teens, maybe it was like the early 2000s or a little bit later, but so much of the anti-fur movement was around how there was false labeling of fur, and somebody would buy a fur product, and if it was, I think it's, if it had a small percentage of fur, they didn't actually have to put animal fur on the label. And so people were unconsciously buying animal fur products and products made with even like cat and dog hair. And once that got out into the media, I think people realized, oh, there is a serious issue with this industry, and visibility on the issue. And brands and retailers really took that to heart and said, we can't support this. And we've seen that with influencers. The whole I'd rather go naked than wear fur, and just kind of continuing to have that argument of this is unacceptable, it's not fashionable, and we can't bring it back. The fur industry is definitely trying to bring it back with the mob wife aesthetic, if you've heard of that, or vintage fur is cool, and we just need to keep fighting against those ideas, because if we're finding ways to bring fur back even just a little bit, it could build that industry.
Is it on? Yeah, Suzanne Lachelier with a graduate of the LLM program at Lewis and Clark. My question is for Haley, but maybe also Elizabeth to some extent. And this is really directed at sort of viability of arguments right now in this climate. I wondered if in your research you'd come across national security related arguments to the zoonotic. You mentioned briefly COVID-19. And so whether you'd come across any mention of the risks of zoonotic diseases in animal events or certainly in the fur industry. And whether you've tried to advance those as a way of pushing your issue.
Absolutely, and I'd love anyone's help with that because it's so true. I mean, we had the spread of COVID in mink farms here in the United States, and there wasn't really any way to do anything about that. USDA officials would show up at fur farms in Utah, and they'd be turned away with somebody, holding a shotgun to them and saying, "Get off my property." They had no authority to do anything about it, and that's really concerning. And now we're seeing avian influenza spread in these facilities, and mink are really interesting because they are able to, take in certain diseases like influenza and mutate it and give it back to humans. That's really concerning. So we're talking about a zoonotic disease. And if there's potential to mutate in mink to a point where it then becomes, it could influence human-to-human infection. And we are allowing workers, low-paid workers, often, undocumented immigrants to work in these facilities and putting them at severe health risks. So I do think these facilities pose enormous biosecurity risks. We've put that argument forward to state health agencies and state ag departments. We've tried to bring that conversation to the USDA to even regulate fur farms in the United States for avian influenza and COVID the way they do with other ag industries, and they're just refusing to. So I would absolutely love help building upon that because I do think that there is movement to be made there.
Can I add one thing? So an example from the research that I did was with the Frog Festival, actually, which I showed you all a photo of. And in order to do that festival, they gather frogs, they hunt frogs out from the wild, and professional jockeys, professional teams find their own frogs, and they all bring them into this central facility. And unlike the rattlesnake roundup, where they kill the animals, the frogs aren't killed, they're released back into the wild. And so there is this disease concern that bubbled up years ago about kind of if you're bringing frogs from far-flung portions of the state and bringing them all together into confinement and then releasing them back out, maybe into different populations, it's hard to keep track of which frog comes from which pool or pond or whatever. And so this was a fight that animal advocates tried to take on a while ago, maybe almost 20 years ago now. And in that case, similar to what you're saying, the California State Agency basically just said, we're going to find a loophole here. Like we're not going to kill all the frogs, right? Because that would kill the event. And this event was so important. This is a tiny town of like 5,000, 10,000 people. And it brings in 50, 60,000 people every year. And so it was so important to kind of California identity and to this local identity that they just like made it work. They just sort of said, we're not really going to worry about that. I'm paraphrasing here, but that was the end result was that they sort of ignored those biosecurity issues and kept throwing this festival. So I think it's an example of how some of these issues are so entrenched in kind of in those cultural pieces of like human identity and all of that.
My name is Joseph, and I work for Animal Issues in Missouri. My question's for Elizabeth. We recently received a report of a company in St. Louis that's offering mouse races as a way to raise money for charities in St. Louis. So I guess what's the first step we should take in addressing a situation like this when it's an animal that's less popular or when it's raising money for a good organization and the harm isn't so obvious?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's like the question of my book, so I'm not sure I have the perfect answer. But I will say that I love talking about animal festivals because every time I do, someone says, I have a festival that, have you heard of this? Or this one's just starting in my hometown or whatever. They're really, animal festivals haven't been brought together as a category really yet. And I think when you start doing that, you start seeing like hundreds and hundreds of these happen all over the country every year. So I had never heard of this, and I think, it's obviously troubling that someone's starting a new animal festival. But that being said, I think some classic tools are talking to the organizers, right? I think sometimes with advocacy, it's just about getting in front of the people who are making the decisions and trying to help them think through things a different way. Kind of the reverse of what was mentioned earlier with like the flies, like they brought the fur on the flies brought the issue to you. It's sort of the reverse, like maybe bringing an issue to them and saying, hey, is there an alternative we can work on? There's stopgap measures. Maybe welfare measures are the best we can do in this environment, short of stopping the event. I think that what an alternative will look like is going to look different for every festival. So the roundup might transition to a no-kill roundup. That might seem like an obvious transition. But the frog jumping contest, what's the alternative there? You can't jump frogs without frogs. It's hard to imagine what an alternative might be. And so I think, they certainly exist. You've had communities that have, instead of a groundhog on Groundhog Day, they have a kid dress up as a groundhog and kind of run across the stage and pick a scroll or whatever. So alternatives are out there, and I think it's about having those conversations with the organizers to keep the benefit, right? Keep the fundraising, keep the good that's happening, while kind of educating and shaping our trajectory away from the bad. So it's not a perfect answer, but it's a start.
Hi, I'm Devin. I'm a 2L at Chicago Kent. This question is for any of you. I'm curious, with the revocation of the Carter-era rule empowering the Council on Environmental Quality to interpret and issue regulatory guidelines on NEPA, if that's creating any new opportunities in your work. I mean, there's obvious the chaos that's causing, but I'm curious if that's also potentially exciting in some areas.
Will it create opportunities? That's a good question. Probably. The agencies that don't have their own NEPA regulations are impacted by this repeal because they would not have to develop their own NEPA regulations. They could just follow the CEQ regulations. There's plenty of case law interpreting NEPA on its face before the CEQ regulations went into effect, so I think that environmental attorneys are able to draw on that case law from prior to sort of help them now. Because fundamentally the principles of NEPA continue. They haven't done anything to the actual statute. So whether it will create an opportunity, I think in not having regulatory guidance, the agencies that don't have NEPA rules are going to mess up a lot more. So there's some opportunity there.
Thank you.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Olivia Ruthven. I'm founder of Polar Bear Preservation League. My question is for Haley. I'm curious on your thoughts of banning fur sales on the local level versus state level. Like Massachusetts has towns that have banned fur sales, and I know there's a hearing, I think, on Wednesday for a statewide ban that already has, I think, 2/3 voters in Massachusetts are supporting, which is great. So I'm just curious on your thoughts on starting at local level and then going to state, or just if a statewide effort is more productive, but maybe it's getting supporters at the local level first, and then you could get a statewide ban.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's hard, it's difficult, right? I think this, first of all, yes, if we can get ordinances passed at a local level and show not only legislators that this is something their constituents care deeply about, but also show that we can get these things passed in even bigger cities, that can be really significant. So let's say we were to pass, like you said, Massachusetts, I think they've got 8 ordinances, eight municipalities with ordinances prohibiting the sale of new fur products. If we were to get a city like Boston to do the same because they saw all of the communities around them, that would be enormous. If we were able to get a city like Chicago, Minneapolis, those would have significant impacts on the fur industry, and they would send a very loud message to the fur industry and to furriers that this is just no longer, a viable industry here. I also think it's really important for working on local ordinances because, and I was talking with somebody about this, about how it sort of creates this patchwork of legislation. And this is it's an interesting strategy, right? And you create a patchwork of legislation around the country, and corporations are just gonna say, this is too much work to navigate. We're just not gonna sell this kind of product. If you're in California and you try to buy a fur product off Amazon, it will come up and say, sorry, we can't sell this to you because this is going to a California address. How do you navigate that when you have, 20 municipalities in Massachusetts with this patchwork of ordinances? They're gonna say this is too difficult. However, I will say there are a number of states with preemption laws, and local ordinances, at least for fur, they aren't an option. Some of the biggest fur-selling states like New York and New Jersey, now Texas, Florida has some weird sort of preemption. Florida has a lot of fur. They're one of the biggest fur-selling states. You'd be surprised because it's not really about warmth. It's about status and luxury. And so at that point we have to say, well, we can't work on ordinances in these states, but this is still a big issue, so we need to tackle it, and we have to work on state legislation. So I would say, both strategies are really important, and you just have to figure out, how to navigate where are you and what is going to be the best approach. Who are your advocates? Do you have leaders in your community? What does your coalition look like? Look at your resources and what's going to be most viable in the geography that you're working in.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe we've reached the end of our time.